There is a little girl sitting cross-legged on the floor of a bedroom that costs more than most people's houses. She is 6 years old, and she is talking to a dollhouse. Not playing with it, talking to it. Her small fingers press against the tiny wooden door of the tiny wooden bedroom on the second floor of that tiny wooden house, and she whispers something that no child that age should ever have to say. She says, "Mommy, are you still in there? Please don't be gone." And that is where Sable Reeves found the note. It was folded 4 times, pressed so flat it had nearly become part of the wall. Sable almost missed it entirely. She had only reached behind the dollhouse to retrieve a crayon that had rolled underneath, and her fingers brushed against something that crinkled, something that felt deliberate, like it had been hidden there by someone who needed it to be found, but only by the right person, at the right time. She pulled it out slowly, already feeling something cold move through her chest before she even opened it. And when she unfolded those 4 creases and read what was written inside, in handwriting that was careful and small and clearly done by an adult who was trying to leave a message without being seen, she felt the world shift under her feet. The note read, "If something happens to me, don't trust my father." Sable looked up from the paper. Thea was watching her from across the room, her big brown eyes unblinking, her small hands folded in her lap the way children fold their hands when they are waiting for someone to leave, because they have learned, through long and painful experience, that everyone does. And in barely more than a whisper, that little girl asked the question that would stay with Sable for the rest of her life. She asked, "Are you going to leave me too?" She only wanted a job. A paycheck. A chance to save her dying mother. But what she found inside that mansion would change all of their lives forever. Because the man offering $2,000 a week wasn't telling her everything. Not even close. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Here are the questions that will stay with you for the next 50 minutes. Why had every nanny who came before Sable walked out of that mansion? There were 4 of them, 4 qualified, experienced women who had each taken the job, signed the paperwork, moved their things in, and then left without explaining why. Not one of them gave a reason. Not one of them stayed long enough to say goodbye to Thea. Why does a 6-year-old fear abandonment so deeply that she folds her hands and waits for it like it is a weather pattern she has already learned to predict? Who wrote the note inside the dollhouse, and how long had it been there? Why does a private residence need 3 armed security guards posted at the gate and 2 more at the front entrance? Who is Carson? And what does Clint Ashford have to hide behind all of that money, all of those walls, all of that silence? These are the questions Sable had no answers to on the morning she drove through those gates. She had a single bag, a folder of references, and a mother whose body was failing her 1 week at a time. She was not looking for a mystery. She was not looking for danger. She was not looking for anything except a salary that would keep the one person she loved most in the world alive long enough to get to the other side of a medical crisis that was swallowing their family whole. She was not looking for Clint Ashford. She was not looking for Thea. And she was absolutely not looking for the kind of secret that, once you know it, you cannot unknow. But sometimes the thing you are not looking for is exactly where you end up. And sometimes the job that looks like a paycheck turns out to be something else entirely. Something that will reach into the part of you that you thought was done hoping, and pull. And what Sable overheard on her very first night inside that house, a conversation she was never meant to hear, carried through the walls of a home that had grown accustomed to keeping its secrets, would make her question everything she thought she understood about the man who was signing her checks. To understand why Sable took the job, you have to understand what her life looked like before it. She was 26 years old, and she had been working since she was 16. Not because she wanted to. Because her family needed her to. Her father had left when she was 12, not dramatically, not with a fight or a scene, just quietly, the way some men do, like they were never really there to begin with. It was just Sable and her mother, Diane, from that point forward, and they had managed. More than managed, actually. Diane Reeves was the kind of woman who could stretch a dollar until it was practically transparent, who could make a home feel warm with nothing more than clean sheets and something simmering on the stove, who laughed louder than anyone Sable had ever known and never once let her daughter see how hard things really were. Sable knew anyway. Children always know. By the time Sable turned 20, she had a certification in early childhood education and a second job on weekends. By 23, she was doing full-time nannying for families in the better parts of the city, banking every extra dollar she could, because Diane had been diagnosed with kidney failure, and the world had gotten significantly smaller and significantly more expensive overnight. The dialysis alone was brutal, 3 times a week, 4 hours each session, and Diane's body was growing more tired with every round. The doctors had been clear. Dialysis was buying time. What Diane needed was a transplant. And what a transplant needed was money that Sable did not have, coming faster than she could earn it. She had been working 2 jobs for 8 months by the time the listing appeared. She had moved out of her apartment and back into the small house she had grown up in so that she could be there in case Diane needed help in the night. She was behind on 2 credit cards and 1 month behind on the house's utilities, which she was now responsible for. She had a jar on the kitchen counter where she put her cash tips, and every Sunday she counted it and did the math again, and every Sunday the math came up the same way, not enough, not yet, and the window narrowing every week. She was not sleeping well. She was not eating well. She was running on the particular kind of fuel that desperate love generates, which burns hot and fast and leaves you hollowed out if you are not careful. The listing said $2,000 per week, plus room and board, for a live-in nanny position caring for a 6-year-old girl. Sable did the math before she finished reading the first sentence. $2,000 a week was just over $8,000 a month. It was more than she had made at both jobs combined. It was, she calculated with her heart hammering, almost exactly what they needed: the dialysis costs, the medications, the specialist fees, the transplant fund that her mother's doctor had helped them set up. If she lived there, she would not be paying rent. If she took the job and kept it for 6 months, she could close the gap that had been opening under her family's feet for the last 3 years. She could breathe. Diane could breathe. She applied before she let herself think about it too long, because she knew that if she thought about it too long, she would start Googling the name and reading things that might make her talk herself out of it. She did not find out about the 4 previous nannies until the morning she went in for the interview. The agency coordinator mentioned it the way you mention a small inconvenience, casually, briefly, with a practiced smile. 4 nannies. Each of them gone within weeks. No explanations on file. And then the coordinator slid a document across the table and asked Sable to sign it before she could take the meeting. A non-disclosure agreement. 14 pages long. But the money came attached to rules nobody could explain. And then she learned why 4 nannies had walked away. The gates were tall and black and topped with something that was not quite decorative, the kind of ironwork that is meant to communicate, not beautify. A man in a dark jacket met Sable's car at the entrance, checked her ID without speaking, and waved her through with the particular economy of motion that people develop when they have done a job so long it has become reflex. The driveway curved through a property that was large enough to feel private from every angle. There were cameras on the exterior. She counted 4 before she stopped counting. There were 2 more men near the front door. The house itself was beautiful. That was the first and most unsettling thing about it. It was genuinely, architecturally beautiful, the kind of home that appears in magazines with no people in it, and it should have felt welcoming but did not. It felt instead like something that had been designed to impress rather than to comfort, built for an idea of living rather than for the actual experience of it. Mrs. Whitfield met her at the door. She was a woman in her early 60s with a composed face and a posture that suggested she had managed this house for a very long time and intended to continue doing so. She welcomed Sable with warmth that was real enough but measured, and she showed her to her room, which was large and simply furnished and looked out over the back garden, which was immaculate. And then she sat Sable down at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a sheet of paper that she described, gently but firmly, as the house guidelines. Never leave Thea unattended. Not for a moment, not even in a room Sable had just stepped out of. Never enter the west wing. It was kept locked, and there was no reason Sable would need to go there, and the matter was not open for discussion. Never speak about the family to anyone outside the household. The NDA covered this legally, but Mrs. Whitfield wanted Sable to understand it as a personal expectation as well. Never ask Mr. Ashford personal questions. He would answer what he chose to answer. Everything else was his business. And finally, and this one Mrs. Whitfield delivered while looking directly at her, never discuss Thea's mother. With anyone. Including Thea, if she brought it up in a way that felt like she was fishing for information. Sable read through the list twice and asked one question: is Thea safe? Mrs. Whitfield's expression shifted just slightly, not with surprise, but with something that looked like relief, as though no one had thought to ask that first before. Yes, she said. She is safe. She is just very lonely. That night, Clint Ashford came home at 8:15. Sable heard him before she saw him, the sound of the front door, low voices near the entrance, a brief exchange with someone she could not see. She had put Thea to bed 20 minutes earlier, and she was sitting at the desk in her room going through her notes when she caught his voice in the hallway, taut with tension. He was on the phone. And she heard, clearly enough to freeze her in place, a sentence that made no sense and every kind of sense at the same time. He said, "Tell Carson the shipment is delayed. And tell him not to call this line again." And Sable sat very still in her chair, holding her pen, listening to the silence that followed. Who was Carson? What shipment? And why did the man paying her $2,000 a week sound like someone who was afraid of the answer to his own phone call? That night, Sable heard voices behind the locked door. You have to understand Thea before you can understand the rest of his story, because Thea is the reason any of it matters. Not the money, not the secret, not the danger that was gathering at the edges of that beautiful, locked-up house. Thea is why Sable stayed. Thea is why everything that came after had any weight at all. She was 6 years old and she had already learned, in the quiet and specific way that children learn the things adults try to hide from them, that the people who were supposed to stay always left. The first nanny had lasted 3 weeks. Thea had liked her. She had been shown that liking someone did not mean they would stay. The second lasted less than 2. The third had been there long enough that Thea had started saving drawings for her, little crayon pictures she folded up and put in her dress pocket to show her after school. When that nanny left, the drawings stayed folded in the pocket. Thea did not throw them away. She put them in the back of her top drawer, under her spare pajamas, and she did not talk about them. The fourth barely made a week. Thea's birthday had come and gone twice without a party, not because no one cared, but because the last party had been organized for a guest list that Thea's mother had put together, and after her mother was gone, no one had known who to call. The people on that list were her mother's people, and they did not come around anymore. Her father worked. He worked constantly, the way some people throw themselves into work when the alternative is sitting still with something they cannot face. He hired people to fill the spaces, the nannies, the tutors, the after-school program, and he signed the checks and he made sure Thea had everything she needed except the particular thing she needed most, which was someone who would still be there tomorrow. She had stopped letting herself get attached quickly. Sable noticed it from the first hour. Thea was polite. She was startlingly articulate for her age. She answered questions directly and made eye contact and had an almost adult quality of self-containment that should not have existed in a 6-year-old body and broke Sable's heart quietly every time she saw it. She was not unfriendly. She was simply prepared. Prepared for Sable to leave, prepared to survive it, prepared to fold this experience up and put it in the drawer with the others. It was on the third morning that something shifted. Sable had made breakfast, nothing special, just scrambled eggs and toast, the way her mother used to make them, with the edges of the toast cut off because she had always hated the edges as a kid and for some reason still did. Thea sat across from her at the kitchen island, watching her cut the toast, and said very quietly, "My mom used to cut the edges off too." And Sable looked up at her, and for just a moment, Thea's face was entirely open. All that careful preparation, all that 6-year-old composure, just gone. She was a little girl who missed her mother. That was all. She looked at Sable and asked, "Do people always leave when they stop loving you? Or do they sometimes leave even when they don't?" Sable put down the knife. She sat down across from Thea and she said, "I don't know why people leave, baby. But I know that sometimes leaving has nothing to do with love at all. And it is never, ever your fault." Thea looked at her for a long moment. Then she picked up her fork and started eating her eggs. She did not say anything else. But something had moved between them, something real, and Sable felt it as clearly as she had ever felt anything. And that is when she understood that the $2,000 a week was no longer the reason she was staying. The next morning, Sable found the note. She had been trying to retrieve a crayon that had rolled underneath the dollhouse, a red one, which Thea had been looking for since the previous afternoon with the focused determination of a child who needs exactly that color and no other. Sable had gotten down on her knees and reached her hand along the baseboard, fingers sweeping, and that is when she felt it. The paper. Folded tight. Pressed into the seam where the dollhouse met the wall, at the very back where no one would see it unless they were looking at exactly that angle. She pulled it out and sat back on her heels and unfolded it slowly, already feeling the strangeness of it before she had read a single word. The handwriting was careful. Even. The letters were small and formed with the kind of deliberateness that comes from wanting each word to be legible despite whatever fear was in the hand that was writing them. And the word said, "If something happens to me, don't trust my father." Sable read it twice. Then she looked up. Thea was watching her from the doorway, still wearing her pajamas, her hair loose around her face. She had been standing there long enough that she had clearly seen Sable find it. And Sable asked, as gently as she could, "Thea, do you know what this is?" And Thea crossed the room, very slowly, and stood next to her, and looked at the paper in Sable's hand. And she said, "My mommy put it there. She said if someone nice ever found it, it meant they were supposed to help." Sable's throat tightened. Thea's mother had been gone for over 2 years. The official story, the one Mrs. Whitfield had given in the briefest possible terms during orientation, was that she had passed away from a sudden illness. A cardiac event. Fast and devastating and final. That was all Sable had been told, and all she had thought to ask about. But a woman who was preparing to die of a cardiac event does not hide a note in her daughter's dollhouse warning whoever finds it not to trust the child's father. A woman who writes a note like that and hides it like that is a woman who was afraid. A woman who believed that something was going to happen to her and that when it did, the people around her daughter would not tell the truth about it. And suddenly, the story no longer made sense. Was Thea's mother really gone? Was what Clint had told the world, what Clint had told his own daughter, actually true? And if it was not, then what had happened to her? And what did Clint Ashford know about it? And who was Carson, who called on private lines about shipments that needed to be delayed, and why was a man living behind armed guards and non-disclosure agreements in a locked West Wing raising a little girl who had learned to fold her hands and wait for people to leave? Sable held the note and looked at Thea and thought about the salary she needed and the mother she was trying to save and the 6-year-old standing in front of her whose own mother might have been trying to be saved too. And she thought, I am not leaving this house until I understand what happened here. If you're still watching, comment, still here, and tell us your state. We love seeing where everyone is watching from. She had not planned to be awake at 11:47. She had been exhausted, the kind of bone-deep tired that accumulates over weeks of sleeping badly in a strange bed while worrying about something that no amount of thinking resolves, and she had fallen asleep at 9:30 with a book still open on her chest. What woke her was a sound she did not immediately recognize. A door, somewhere in the far end of the house. And then voices. Low and controlled, but not controlled enough. There was an edge in them that cut through the walls and pulled her up from sleep with the sudden sharpness of cold water. She did not go into the hall. She sat on the edge of her bed and listened. Clint's voice first, and she recognized it now. She had learned in the past week that Clint Ashford had two registers, the professional one he used during the brief interactions with household staff, flat and efficient in giving nothing away, and then this other one, the one she was hearing now, that was lower and faster and carrying something inside it that sounded like barely managed panic. He was saying, "You told me it was over. You said last month was the last. You said last month was the last of it." And then another voice, one she had not heard before, smooth and unhurried in a way that made the hair on her arms rise, said, "Nothing is ever the last of it, Clint. You of all people know that." She did not hear the rest. The voices moved away from whatever was near the wall and she lost them in the architecture of the house. But she sat on the edge of her bed for a long time afterward, running the conversation through her head. The second voice. That unhurried, patient, almost amused quality. She had worked for enough families over enough years to know what fear sounded like in an adult man when he thought no one was listening. And what she had heard in Clint Ashford's voice, at 11:47 on a Tuesday night, was fear. She went to the window and looked out at the driveway. There was a black SUV parked at the edge of the property, just outside the reach of the exterior lights, in the shadow of the tree line. It sat there for another 40 minutes. And then, without headlights, it pulled away. The next morning, Clint Ashford came to the breakfast table for the first time since Sable had arrived. He sat across from Thea and drank his coffee and read something on his phone and said very little. But before he left, he looked at Sable with an expression she could not read and said, "You have not asked me any questions." It was not phrased as a question itself. It was something else. Something that sounded, if she was reading it correctly, like relief. She met his eyes and said, "I'm here for Thea." He nodded slowly, as though that answer had passed some kind of test she had not known she was taking. And then he left. And Sable looked at Thea, who was drawing a picture of a house with a garden and a woman standing in the garden, and she thought, I need to know who that man on the phone was. How would you feel if it was you? If you had taken a job just to survive, and then found yourself standing inside a secret that someone was clearly willing to go to extraordinary lengths to protect? Would you stay? Would you grab your bag and walk out and tell yourself the money wasn't worth it? Or would you look at that little girl and realize that sometimes the choice has already been made for you? Clint Ashford was not what Sable had expected, and she had been preparing herself for a particular type for the entire drive to the interview. She had anticipated someone polished and remote, the kind of man who moves through the world with the specific confidence that comes from never having been told no in a way that stuck. She had been ready for condescension, for a man who would look through her rather than at her, who would see a nanny and see a function rather than a person. She had worked for men like that before. She knew how to be invisible when invisible was what they needed. But Clint Ashford looked tired. That was the first thing. Not the glamorous exhaustion of a man who works too hard by choice, but the real kind, the kind with shadows under the eyes that concealer might manage but cannot erase, the kind that lives in the set of the jaw and the way the shoulders carry themselves slightly too high, as though bracing for something that might arrive at any moment from any direction. He was in his late 30s. He was, objectively, a striking man, dark-haired, well-dressed in the effortless way of someone who has had money long enough that it shows without trying. But all of that was secondary to the exhaustion, and secondary to something else that she noticed when he looked at Thea. When Clint looked at his daughter, something in his face changed. The guardedness dropped, just slightly, just enough. Not gone, never fully gone, but softer. Like a man who had built walls around every part of himself except that one. Like whatever Thea was to him was the one thing the walls did not cover. He was formal with Sable, not unkind. He laid out his expectations clearly and without apology, and she respected that even if she did not entirely trust him. He said Thea's routine mattered more than his convenience and that if there were ever a conflict between the two, Thea came first. He said he was aware that the position had been difficult to fill and that he appreciated her willingness to be there. He did not explain why it had been difficult to fill. He did not mention the previous nannies. He did not bring up the NDA or the house rules as though they required any defense, which was its own kind of tell. And he did not, at any point during that initial meeting or in the days that followed, ask Sable anything personal, not about herself, not about her life, not about why she was there. As though he had already decided that knowing less was safer, for both of them. Which meant that he was a man who had already thought through the implications of someone like Sable being inside his house. Which meant that whatever was buried inside those walls, he was not sure he could keep it buried forever. And he knew it. She saw him for the first time on a Thursday afternoon, through the window of the library where she was reading to Thea. He was standing at the gate, not pressing the intercom, not signaling, just standing there with his hands in the pockets of a coat that was too warm for the weather, looking at the house. Looking, specifically, at the upper windows. He was medium height, with a face that was pleasant enough to be forgettable but had something in the eyes that was neither pleasant nor forgettable. He stood there for perhaps 90 seconds. And then one of the security men walked to the gate and said something to him, and he smiled. She could see the smile even from this distance, and the smile was the most unsettling thing about him, because it looked like a smile that had never once been connected to anything warm, and he turned and walked back toward a car that was parked on the street, and he drove away without hurrying. Mrs. Whitfield came into the library 15 minutes later and told Thea it was time for her afternoon rest. She did it with the kind of intentional cheerfulness that means there is something she needs to say to the other adult in the room and needs the child gone first. When Thea had gone upstairs, Mrs. Whitfield turned to Sable and said, very carefully, if a man ever comes to the gate or approaches you when you are outside with Thea, you bring her inside immediately and you notify security. You do not speak to him. You do not acknowledge him. You come inside. Sable asked, what does he look like? And Mrs. Whitfield said, you'll know. And then, after a pause that lasted just long enough to feel like a decision, his name is Carson Hale. He and Mr. Ashford have a history. He should not be here, and if he ever gets past the gate, you call me first and security second. Sable looked at her. What kind of history? Mrs. Whitfield straightened. The kind that is none of our business and all of our problem, she said. And Sable thought about the voice she had heard through the walls at 11:47. The smooth, unhurried voice that had said, nothing is ever the last of it. She thought about the black SUV that had sat in the dark at the edge of the driveway for 40 minutes. And she felt, with a certainty that had nothing to do with evidence and everything to do with instinct, that Carson Hale was patient. That he had been waiting a long time for something. And that he was getting closer to being done waiting. It happened on a Saturday morning, which is important because Saturdays were the one day the weekend security rotation was lighter. One man at the gate instead of two. Clint was not home. He had gone to a meeting that had been called the night before, the kind that gets called with no explanation and requires you to be somewhere at 7 in the morning, the kind that people who have things to answer for are sometimes summoned to. Mrs. Whitfield had gone to collect a grocery order. It was just Sable and Thea, and they were in the garden, because Thea had asked to plant something, a small pot of marigolds that Sable had bought at the farmer's market the previous week, because Thea had pointed at them with the specific interest of a child who has seen something beautiful and wants to make it last. Thea was on her knees in the garden bed, her small hands in the soil, the marigolds laid out beside her in a neat row, when Sable felt it. The particular stillness that falls over a space when something is wrong. She looked up from where she was crouching beside Thea, and the gate was open. Not all the way, just ajar, swinging slightly on its hinge. And the security man was not visible. And the black SUV was parked on the far side of the street. And Carson Hale was walking across the lawn. He was not running. He was not hiding. He walked toward them the way a man walks when he wants you to understand that he is not afraid of you and is not in a hurry, because he believes that time and circumstances have already arranged themselves in his favor. He was perhaps 30 yards away when Sable stood up. She stepped in front of Thea, not dramatically. She moved the way you move when you want to block a sight line without causing panic. She said, very clearly, "Thea, go inside." Thea looked up. She saw the man. And something happened in her face that told Sable everything: recognition, and beneath the recognition, a fear that was old and practiced, a fear that this child had felt before. "Thea. Go. Right now." Thea got up and ran. Carson stopped when she turned back to face him. He smiled that smile. He said, "You must be the new one." And his voice was exactly what she had heard through the walls at 11:47. Smooth. Unhurried. She could feel her heart, but she kept her face still and she said, "You need to leave." He tilted his head. He said, "He hasn't told you, has he? About the girl's mother?" It was not a question. It was a key, offered casually, the way you offer something to someone when you want them to open a door for you. She said nothing. He continued, "She didn't die, you know. Not the way he says. She reached out to someone. She needed help. And no one came in time." He paused. "I'm trying to make sure that doesn't happen again." And then the security man appeared from the side of the house at a run, and Carson raised both hands in a gesture of performed innocence, and he turned and walked back across the lawn, and the gate swung closed behind him, and Sable stood there in the garden with her hands shaking and the marigolds still laid out in their neat row on the ground. She went inside and found Thea sitting at the top of the stairs with her arms wrapped around her knees. Sable sat down next to her. Neither of them said anything for a minute. Then Thea said, very quietly, "He used to come when my mom was here too." And Sable said, "Do you know why?" Thea shook her head. Then she said, "But my mom was scared of him. And she was scared of my dad. And she told me she was going to fix it. And then she was gone." Think about that. Think about being 6 years old and carrying that. Think about what it means to grow up inside a silence that big. And tell me, what would you do if you were Sable? If you knew that a little girl's mother might not have died the way everyone said she did, and the man paying you $2,000 a week to keep quiet might know the truth, and the man standing in the garden might be even more dangerous than the man signing your checks. The West Wing door was not as locked as it had always seemed. Sable discovered this by accident, or perhaps not entirely by accident, because the truth is that she had been thinking about that door for weeks, turning it over in her mind every night before sleep in the way you turn over a problem that you know you are eventually going to have to face. It was late on a weeknight, well past midnight, and she had gotten up for water and had walked the long hall toward the kitchen out of habit, and she had passed the West Wing corridor, and the door at the end of it had been left open. Just slightly. Just an inch. Enough for light, a lamp, somewhere inside, to reach out into the dark hall like a signal. She should have kept walking. She knew that. She walked through the door anyway. It was a study. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a heavy desk, and on the desk, not hidden, not locked away, but laid out as though someone had been looking through them recently, a series of documents. A medical file. A letter, dated 18 months ago, addressed to a county prosecutor's office. Photographs. And a manila envelope, unsealed, with a name written on the outside in handwriting that she recognized immediately as the same handwriting from the note in the dollhouse. The name on the envelope was Thea's. Her name was Miriam Ashford. She had not died. She had left. That was the first thing Sable understood when she began to piece it together from the documents on the desk, some of which Clint had clearly gathered himself, some of which appeared to have been sent to him from a source she could not immediately identify. Miriam had been trying to leave Clint for over a year before she disappeared, but leaving a man like Clint Ashford, a man with the resources and the connections that Clint had, was not a simple thing. Carson Hale was not Clint's enemy in the way Sable had assumed. Carson Hale was Miriam's brother. He had been trying to find her. He had been approaching the house not to threaten but to look for evidence of what had happened to her, because no one had told him where she was, and no one had explained why she had simply vanished from her daughter's life with no goodbye and no body, and a story that nobody had asked too many questions about. And the letter to the prosecutor's office, the one dated 18 months ago, the one with Miriam's signature at the bottom, changed everything. She was alive. She had been placed in protective custody after cooperating with an investigation into a financial network that had Clint Ashford's name in it, and the names of several other men, and a series of transactions that were described in the letter in language that was technical and careful and clearly written by someone who had been coached by lawyers. She had not been able to take Thea. She had not been permitted to contact her. And the note in the dollhouse, the note she had hidden before she left, in the only place she trusted would stay undisturbed, in the heart of the thing her daughter loved most, was the only goodbye she had been able to give. Clint Ashford knew. He had the letter. He had known for at least 18 months that Miriam was alive and that she had cooperated against him and that the investigation was ongoing and that time was running out. That was why the security had never let up. That was why the previous nannies had been driven out, not by anything Clint had done directly, but by the atmosphere of a house waiting for a storm. That was why he had looked tired every morning for what was probably years. He was not grieving his wife. He was waiting for the consequences of what he had done to catch up with him. And they were coming. She told Mrs. Whitfield first, because Mrs. Whitfield was the one person in that house who she believed might actually do something. She laid out what she had found in the West Wing study, and she watched the older woman's face move through a sequence of expressions that settled, finally, on something that looked like grief mixed with resolution. Mrs. Whitfield said, "I suspected. I have suspected for a long time. But suspecting and knowing are different things." She sat for a long moment with her hands flat on the kitchen table. Then she said, "Thea cannot stay here. Not when this breaks open." She said it the way you say something you have been holding on to for months, waiting for permission to say out loud. The investigation that Miriam Ashford had cooperated with moved faster than anyone expected once the prosecutors received confirmation from a source inside the household that the documents still existed. Clint was taken into custody on a Tuesday morning, quietly, without the drama that Sable had half expected, without the scene she had braced herself for. He was in the back of a federal vehicle before Thea was awake, and Sable sat with Thea at the kitchen island and made scrambled eggs with the edges of the toast cut off and told her, as gently as truth can be told, that her father was going to have to go away for a while. Thea ate her eggs. She asked, "Is my mommy still alive?" And Sable said, because she was not going to lie to this child, not ever, not once, "Yes. She is. And she has been thinking about you every single day." Thea put down her fork. She picked it back up. She said, "I knew the note was for something." And Sable had to look at the ceiling for a moment to keep herself together. 3 months later. That is the time it took. 3 months of legal proceedings, of testimony, of the careful and painstaking process of extracting a woman from protective circumstances and reuniting her with a daughter who had spent 2 years believing that everyone who loved her eventually disappeared. 3 months of Sable staying, not because of the salary, which had long since become irrelevant, but because Thea needed a constant, and Sable had become that constant, and you do not walk away from a 6-year-old who has already been walked away from too many times. Diane Reeves received her transplant 6 weeks into those 3 months. A match had been found, a small miracle inside a larger one, and the surgery went smoothly, and Sable got the call while she was sitting in the garden with Thea, who was tending to her marigolds, which had survived. Sable cried, quietly, turned away, and Thea put a small dirt-covered hand on her arm and said, "Good news?" And Sable said, "The best." And Thea nodded seriously, the way she did, and said, "My mom is coming on Friday." And that was true. It was true. The reunion between Miriam and Thea was private, and it belongs to them, but what Sable saw, from the hallway, was a woman dropping to her knees on the entry hall floor and a little girl running into her arms with a sound that was not a word, just a sound, the sound of something long broken finally being allowed to come back together. Mrs. Whitfield stood beside Sable with her arms folded and her eyes bright, and neither of them said anything, because there was nothing that needed to be said. Carson Hale, who had never been the villain, who had been a brother standing at a gate, trying to find his sister, trying to understand what had happened to a woman who had trusted the wrong man and paid for it for 2 years, came to the house that Friday too. He shook Sable's hand. He said, "Thank you for staying." She said, "I stayed for Thea." He said, "I know. That's why I'm thanking you." As for Sable herself, she did not stay at the house after Miriam came back. That chapter belonged to Miriam and Thea and the long, patient work of rebuilding what had been broken. But she came on Sundays. She brought Diane with her sometimes, who was recovering slowly and steadily and who had taken an immediate and enormous liking to Thea, because Diane had always known how to find the people who needed someone to laugh a little louder than the room expected. And Thea, for the first time since she had been old enough to understand that the world was not as safe as it should be, stopped folding her hands when people arrived. She stopped waiting for them to leave. She learned, slowly and with evidence, that sometimes people stay. And the note, the one Miriam had folded 4 times and pressed into the seam of the dollhouse, Sable kept it. Not as a warning. Not as a reminder of what had been wrong in that house. She kept it as a warning. Not as a reminder of what had been wrong in that house. She kept it as evidence of something she believed more firmly now than she ever had before, that the people who love their children will find ways to protect them even from inside the worst circumstances. That a mother's last act, before she had to disappear, had been to leave a door open for the right person to walk through. And the right person had been looking for a red crayon on a Thursday morning and had reached into a shadow and found something instead that changed everything. Life is not always clean. It does not always give us warning. But sometimes, just sometimes, the worst situation you ever walked into turns out to be the place where the best thing you ever did was waiting for you. And the little girl who used to fold her hands and wait for people to leave is, as of right now, learning to garden. Her marigolds are doing beautifully. Think about this story the next time you feel like a job is just a job. The next time you feel like the thing you're doing to survive is separate from the person you're becoming. Because it isn't. It never is. Every place we show up, every room we walk into, every child we sit with at a kitchen table, it all counts. All of it. Every bit of it counts. If this story moved you the way it moved us putting it together, leave a comment and tell us what part hit you hardest. Was it Thea folding her hands? Was it the note in the dollhouse? Was it Sable staying, even when everything said she should run? Tell us. And if someone in your life could use a reminder that their presence matters more than they know, share this with them tonight. We will see you in the next one.